Hi, everyone. So glad to have you here. I'm here with Brad Wetzler today, and we're going to be talking about memoir writing secrets. Brad Wetzler began his writing and publishing career serving as an editor at Outside Magazine, where he worked with some of America's finest nonfiction writers. He later turned in his editor's pen for writers and traveled the world, writing about adventure and exploration, business, politics, the environment, sports, and wellness. In midlife, after recovering from a long, debilitating depression, he became a certified yoga teacher and began exploring and writing about our inner landscape, psychology, spirituality, meditation, and yoga. Brad holds a master's degree in journalism from Northwestern University. He is a book editor and writing coach. His forthcoming memoir, Into the Soul of the World, actually his memoir is out now, was published by Hachette Book Group in March 2023. He lives in Austin, Texas. Brad, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for coming. And it's kind of overwhelming to see how many of you are here, and I'm just grateful for all of you. So I'll just dive in. As Sean said, my book came out in March. It's called Into the Soul of the World, and it's really is. A lot of memoirs can be very slice of life, and this one's actually fairly expansive. It covers a lot of years from about the time I was 29 till fairly recently, with some flashbacks to childhood, and it mainly focuses on my career as an adventure writer, my desire to become one at almost any cost, and then my descent into a PTSD, related depression and flashbacks that led to many years of extreme over medication with psychiatric drugs, which I now view as an addiction, a form of addiction. And then after 5, 6, I don't even know how many years, it was kind of a slow progression, but there was a time when I could barely, walk down to the cafe with a handful of magazines, trying to make sense of articles in magazines that I had only a few years earlier had cover stories on. Then after the suicide of a friend who was on a massive cocktail of medications too, I just decided I had to pull my life together, or that was going to be my fate. And I began about a 10-year reclamation project that was quite slow and arduous, and sometimes going down dead alleys, and until a lot of therapy, a lot of yoga, and a lot of other modalities too, and until I was traveling again and had some extraordinary experiences in Israel, Palestine, and India that helped along my journey. So that's kind of an overview of the book. It's it is kind of a recovery story. The title Into the Soul of the World, it sort of really is it was, in addition to reclaiming my mind and body, it really was a soul reclamation, understanding how trauma affects us and how it really does almost steal our sense of selves, our souls. And I won't ruin the whole book for you, but I end up in India in a cave with 100-year-old yogi, and who hits me on the head and leads to, first of all, just a tsunami of tears, and then the next day a kind of a mind-blowing mystical experience. And again, I was a journalist. I also wholeheartedly have had little mystical experiences my whole life, but this was kind of out of this world. And so that's a summary of the book. And I'm here tonight. I want to talk to you a little bit about memoir writing. I'm a teacher and a memoir coach, and I really want to be of service. This book was I actually wrote it in about 7 months. By the time the contract was signed, it was October of 2021. And I had a deadline of May 1st in 2022. And I basically hit the deadline. I was a couple weeks late, which I think is more a testament to how much this story was kind of needing to come out. It was a pretty complex story thematically. I mean, there's this adventure story, this telling of a tale about, my rise as an editor and this desire to want to imitate and become these writers that I had worked with, and probably against my better judgment, given my, past and maybe my sort of fragile nervous system in a way, but I did, and I succeeded. And then, so there's this sort of adventure story, but then there's also a story that I'd call kind of an adventures in psychiatry, which is sort of the story of how I, fell, prey and participated in kind of the medicalization of mental health. And I'm not anti-psychiatry, if you read the book, you'll see that, a psychiatrist kind of ended up saving my life, in addition to the 100-year-old yogi, who a really wise, focused, patient psychiatrist. And I will still say I still take a couple of meds. I take an ADD med and I take an antidepressant. So I don't want you to think that I'm utterly anti-psychiatry. I think it's a very problematic thing. But so that's the other narrative. And the third narrative, or at least one of the other narratives, is a spiritual story. And I'd grown up a kind of a Jesus freak, and had been into Bible study and into, a lot of this kind of evangelical stuff on my own. My family had actually been Episcopalians, and then I dropped that for the beat writers and life as a college student, and then as a kind of a real grumpy fact-based journalist, and how I ended up seeing, for me anyway, having a sense of something greater than myself became so integral to my healing. And I think it's a very grounded spiritual story. Obviously there's this huge mystical experience, but I do believe, like with Carl Jung, that after midlife, I mean, all problems have really spiritual answers, and it really is, it for me proved to be such a linchpin. But so did everything else I did. I mean, so those are the three main narratives, and I thought I would just talk a little bit tonight. The first thing I'll mention is the patience. I sold this book on proposal after really years of pondering, thinking, attempting to write. And so I guess the first thing I wanted to say is, if you're in that boat of knowing you have a story, I just really do urge a certain amount of patience. And I wasn't ready to write. I first thought I might write it back in 2013 when I got back from a trip to Israel and Palestine. I walked the Jesus Trail, trying to understand my childhood obsession with religion and Jesus, and I thought that was the book. And at that point, though, I still was in a fog of a trauma-based fog. I still was struggling with my life, and as much as I wanted to write it, I found myself, writing passages over and over again, sort of like the movie The Shining. I mean, and it was trauma writing. I was writing about some things that happened in childhood that was traumatic. And I seemed to, when I look back on that early manuscript, I'd written the same stories, 10 times literally, in like a 250-page manuscript. So I finally realized I had a lot more healing to do. And eventually it just became obvious I was ready to write it. And that's why I think it did come out so fast. As somebody who's been an editor and a writer both, I've been on both sides of the desk. And I think, when I was young, I wrote by talent and intuition, and I was kind of a shit show. I mean, I wrote some stuff I would say was pretty darn good, but I was sort of reinventing the wheel every time I went out to write a story, and really thinking that it was about energy and sort of voice, and I had really, looking back, had no idea what I was doing. And then eventually I landed a job teaching memoir in Denver, and I'd written a lot of first person and I'd edited a lot of first person, but I really didn't understand memoir at the time. This is about 10 years ago, and I taught myself how to teach memoir, and slowly it became a passion for me. And I knew at that point that I really wanted to write a memoir, but I learned in the process, I read a lot and I learned kind of what I had done in my younger years that was successful and what I'd done that wasn't. And I began to kind of almost codify or create kind of a way to teach personal narrative writing that was based upon my experiences and my work as an editor. And also one of the best gifts I've had was I've worked with so many good editors, and that's just how, I think the main ways we learn as writers is writing, being edited or getting feedback and reading. And I just had an abundance of good editors working on my stuff. And every time, I was always up for that collaboration with a good editor. And I just learned so much from that. So I developed this kind of, this way of writing. And I know there's lots of ways to write a memoir. And so I happen to kind of practice and teach a particular style that I would call showing and telling. You hear a lot in writing workshops about the importance of showing, but not many people in creative nonfiction really talk about the art of telling. And I just think, for me, a good memoir has both. Of course, you want a memoir to have some novel-esque passages. You want scenes that make the reader feel like they're there, and the passing of time and an intense sensory experience that the reader crawls into with you. But you also want anecdotes. You want shorter stories. But you also want kind of I do, at least. I want reflection and understanding, and to bring into to allow the story to say as much as it can say in story form, but then to cap it off with saying what you mean and meaning what you say and doing that well. So I thought I'd spend some time tonight kind of talking about the method I used in writing this book and that I teach. And so, it starts out with this concept. It's called earning the tell. And I don't know if any of you have heard that before, but show of hands, how many people love to receive unsolicited advice from strangers? Yeah, not many of us. But if you know someone and trust somebody, you might be more open to hearing feedback or hearing a philosophy of life or hearing about someone's problems or interpretations of their problems or their plans for going forward. And so storytelling is how we do that in memoir. And of course, our brains are wired for story. So I saw my job as a memoirist is to tell a really good story. And that's what it's about. I mean, I think any agent or book editor will tell you that a successful memoir has really good storytelling and has a strong, provocative author voice. And if you can do those two things, there's so many ways to write a memoir, but those two things are kind of necessary. And we know what good storytelling is, or we have an idea, but what's voice? Voice is more than just the language you use. It's kind of the lens or the worldview that you see the world through. What excites you, what fears you have, what ethos you have, what kind of sense of ethics, and it's just your every view of the world. When I was an editor at the magazine, we'd come up with an idea to send a writer to climb a particular mountain in South America or to visit a swamp in Louisiana, and that story we knew could end up looking a variety of ways based on who we gave the story to. And so that voice, that's what we were interested in, is who could we match with this particular place and story idea, and what voice would they bring? So I invite you to spend some time really thinking about your voice. It's something that develops over time, and but it's an important thing. But from there, so earning the tell. So you tell a good story. And a good story, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has, and you as a memoirist are the main character. And so with you, we need a really rounded sense of you. And since the word I shows up so much in a memoir, we need that word I to evoke a full a full-bodied idea of you as a character, just as if you were making up a character. In fact, I often tell my students to try writing in third person sometimes about themselves as a way to kind of release themselves from any shame from, from pulling in, from writing about yourself. But so what's around character? Well, we also don't want to flood, the reader with extraneous stuff. We kind of want to develop a character that's appropriate for the particular story you're telling. And all of us, I think Walt Whitman said, we are multitudes. I'm a multitude. So all of us have so many parts of us. A lot of them are incongruent. And so when you develop yourself as a character, you want to keep in mind that you want your quirks, you want things that, again, scare you, that light you up. You want a sense, but you want a sense of coherence, though. So if I'm telling the story about how I became an adventure writer, how my life fell apart, and how I pieced it back together, there's parts of me that don't belong in that story. If I happen to be, on the side a champion ping pong player, or I'm just thinking there's any number of things that are part of my character that just don't come to bear in this particular book. So just know that there's a bit of subtraction from who you are, as well as including all these things about who you are. So telling a story. So here's how I do it. I sit down and I write out, I say I show up in the morning at my computer, and I know that I want to start writing. Say I'm a third of the way into the book, and I basically know the general material I'm going to be working on that day. I just sit down and try to tell the very best story I can about this particular time in my life. Knowing that I need to occasionally drop in all the who, what, where, when, why of what's going on. But I need to tell, it has to build to a climax, right? Oh, this is stuff you all know, but a crisis and climax, and kind of, and then come to some kind of resolution. Well, let's talk about, so I write that rough draft. And then here's what I do. I use this tool I call the VAST tool. And this is something I made up. It's V as in Victor, A, S as in Sam, and T. And I'll unpack what that means. And so V is for vulnerability. And, any good story needs a character that has a lot of vulnerability, that shares who they are from the heart, from, their challenges again, and their quirks. And so I go back through what I've written and I say, have I been vulnerable enough? And I'll go back in and kind of tidy that up. Maybe not. Maybe I need to get more vulnerable. What I'm really struggling with here. And then A, then I look through and I go, A is for action. And there's two types of action that I want in my writing. I want external action. I want strong verbs that lead the reader, into an active story. Say I've never done this, but say you're writing about cycling across the country. We want you pedaling, we want you camping, we want you doing all the things actively, climbing the mountain on your bike, all this stuff. So that's the external action. And accompanying that, we do want a lot of sensory detail to make that action come alive. Sensory detail. But then there's also something that is internal action. And sort of the way I think of internal action is craving or desire. And so I go through and I'll try to make sure that my character, that my Brad character, is fueled by desire, that the reader really knows what I'm needing or wanting at this particular chapter or this particular part of the book. And that can change throughout the book. At the beginning of the book, in my book, all I wanted was to become an adventure writer. And that's the rocket fuel for almost the entire first third of the book. After my life falls apart, though, all I want is healing, and I'll do anything and everything to get healing. And so, this internal action, this craving, and at the end of each chapter, of course, the reader gets to see whether I get or don't get what I want in that particular chapter. Same with like at the end of a long section. So some chapters you get what you want. Sometimes you become more and more. I became an adventure writer that I had pursued to be. Other chapters I revealed that how much I was struggling at the time, and you see me wanting to become a more successful adventure writer, but really getting bogged down in depression and flashbacks and drugs. And so again, you want to vary, your chapter. Sometimes you get the character gets what she wants, and sometimes they don't. So that's A. S is suspense. And suspense is, I just think of suspense as page turnability. All stories are essentially mystery stories, and you want the reader to get to the end of the chapter, end of the page, and turn the page. And so I think of that as giving the reader only the information they need on a need to know basis. So I try not to spill the beans. If I don't tell what outcome, I don't even, I might do some foreshadowing and hinting at where I'm headed, but I don't reveal any outcomes until the end of the chapter. So they keep turning the page. So that's suspense. And then T is transformation. And by the end of that chapter, that's what I was talking about, is you just want to be in a different place. Did I get what I want, or didn't I? Am I the same person? No, you want to be a little bit different. You're either different physically, emotionally, spiritually. So every good story has, I think these 4 elements at least. And I literally go back over my rough draft, and that's how I kind of write. I actually would print it out, the rough draft, place it next to my computer, and I rewrite that morning's writing now with more power, more desire, more craving, more vulnerability, more suspense, and then by the end, transformation. So then I have this story here, and I happen to prefer writing memoir in the past tense, and for the reasons I'm going to tell you here. I know very good memoirs are written in the present, and I have nothing against them. I just think there's some gifts of writing in the past, and one of them is kind of this dance of time, of the difference between who you are now and who you were then. And so, as I write the story, I try to crawl into the voice of the person I was at that time. If I was 12, I don't write in the language of a 12-year-old, but I write with maybe the sense of wonder of a 12-year-old. If I'm writing when I was, in my 30s, I'm a different person there. And that's called the voice of innocence, or the then voice. And so then after the story, I go into what's called a retrospection mode, or reflection mode, and I ask myself a couple of questions. And the first phase is I reflect from the heart, and I basically, and of course I vary this up. I don't use these words every time, but basically the question is, looking back from today, I feel X about that experience I just went through. I have these emotions about it, and also about that younger person I was then. And so an important thing about this feeling material, or this heart material, is to try to embody that material. You want to often, when you write about emotions, even if you're writing in the middle of a story about emotions, you want to embody it. The anger started in just underneath my solar plexus and rose up my chest into my throat, and then it burst out as angry words, or the sadness sunk deep into my belly and down into my pelvis. So you just, feelings are hard to portray to readers, and we want to do better than just say I was happy, sad. We want to put them into your body, because that's actually how our feelings work. And so after the story, you reflect from the heart, and then you move into the head, and you reflect from the head, and you say, looking back, I now think X and Y about what I went through. And this is where analyzing comes in. This is where conjecture comes in. This is where asking yourself questions and trying to answer them on the page comes in. You know, I don't speak French, so every time I say this, I feel like a phony, but apparently the root of essay comes from a French word that it actually means to take a stab at. And so memoir like essays, and you really do not need to know before you sit down to write what you think about these experiences. What we really want is almost your real time, like working through stuff on the page. You know, what was I thinking as I walked the streets of Jerusalem, trying to connect with my childhood obsession with Jesus? You know, I don't know what I wanted. Was it to actually merge with God? Let me explore that for a paragraph. Or was I trying to merge with some other part of me that I was missing, or that was sort of somehow I was trying to connect with? I don't know if that's true. Maybe I was just trying to grow up. I mean, so you see, I'm just making all this up here, but there's a way that you can ask yourself a question and literally just try to work it out and go on for a few paragraphs. And so that's this 3-part method. And then I'll quickly add, there's a part 4 you can add, which can be reporting. So if like in my case, there's a lot of spiritual and yoga stuff in this book. So I offer occasionally, like, oh, let me add one more thing about the thinking part. It's often wonderful to pull in kind of a universalness to that. This is where you connect with your reader and all readers. You know, we humans, we're so fraught, we're so stuck in our heads, we're so stuck in our patterns. And occasionally, you know, I know Cheryl Strayed really uses that we a lot, and I sometimes use it. And it's just a good strategy for getting out of your own experience and talking to your reader and sharing these challenges that are just so human. And so that 4th thing was just bringing in some reporting, like writing about some external subject. But I'm going to pass on that for tonight. It starts to get too confusing for now. So we've got this 3 parts. So that's heavily formatted, right? And that works like that. You can also reverse it sometimes. You could start with the thinking part and say, you know, we humans are again so stuck in our heads. We're so stubborn. You know, let me tell you a story about a time when I was so stubborn. You know, so you can reverse that order even. But now I want to just go, before we get into the question phase. Of course, I don't always just write in these 3 chunks. It does you can make this more complex. And the way you do that is by paying attention to time. As you tell a story or write a scene that becomes your essential story, you notice when there's an opportunity when things might slow down. You know, for example, if I'm driving 90 miles an hour on a highway, I don't have a lot of time to reflect, to move into the heart and the head, so to speak. But if I come to a stop sign, you know, I put my foot on the brake, I slow down, I take a deep breath, I place my hand on my heart. Wow, I'm feeling a lot right now. And today, when I look back on that person I was in the middle of this journey, I have so much compassion for him. And I now see and understand, I think, why he was doing what he was doing. So you see, there's ways to when time, you know, slows down, there's room to do this kind of reflection. Okay, so it doesn't need to all happen in this traditional 3-part system. It actually can become complex. And of course, I'd like you to buy my book, but one of the things I would like you to try to do, if you do buy it, or if you have some other favorite book, you try to notice when the author is telling a story. Try to notice when they're sharing emotion, and try to notice when they're doing analyzing. And just, you know, I would just take a pencil and literally like mark the whole chapter out and just notice the pattern that they're using. And there's a couple of other devices you can use, of course, too. You can use inner monologue. That's another tool I use. So as I'm you know, crawling across the floor of the cave, you know, I might say something like, gosh, it's dark in here. I mean, that's a bad example. Or gosh, I'm feeling nervous. And you can put that into italics. And so that's another way to add complexity and another kind of inner voice to it, which is different from the reflective voice. But now I'm probably starting to get a little bit complicated. So I'm going to pause here. The basic gist of this, if you lost me, is essentially to tell good stories, to share from the heart, and to share from the head. And then write your way to the next story. The transition is where so much good stuff happens. You got to get me, the reader, from A to B, and that's often where you reveal important stuff about the themes you're working on. Let me think if there's anything else. And the final thing I think is to remember, that this is a relationship, and the reason I do use these tools is because I know that if I don't, I can get caught in my own head and think that I'm writing a good story for someone else to read when in fact it's only readable by me. I use so much insider information or fail to develop stuff so much that it's too insular. And so these tools really help me to make sure that I'm bringing the reader along for the ride. And that's a real balance. I mean, I know that you want to write from the heart. You want to write inspired writing and stuff that's honest and true. But you want to make sure before you turn anything in that someone can make sense of it and someone can actually go on the journey with you. So I thought maybe one final thing before questions, I just read a few pages here for about 5 minutes. This is from the scene where I'm entering the cave. And so it goes like this. And see if you can't hear. There's a lot of, I'll leave it there. We will have to get on our knees and crawl, I thought. I slipped off my shoes and set them on the ground behind a stone bench. I stood up and breathed in the moist jungle air. The leafy green canopy blocked all signs of the crisp blue sky. I followed 6 friends from the group up the trail's last 10 yards. One by one, we passed under a brass bell slung from a tree. I tapped my fingers against it until its ring filled the jungle air and echoed across the valley. Then I crouched on all fours. With my neck mala dragging in the dirt, I crawled through the gap between 2 large boulders. The ground felt like sandpaper on my hands and knees. Seconds later, it was as if somebody had turned out the lights. I squirmed along the coarse ground, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the candlelight, and a strange world began to reveal itself. My eyes darted around at the cave's walls, decorated with indecipherable writing and framed pictures of Hindu gods. The cave wasn't large, about the size of a small living room, but it was bigger than I'd imagined when my friend David told me about it and the ancient yogi who lived there. He's 100 years old, he told me. I didn't believe him. I was still breathing hard from the hour-long hike up the mountain, and my throat felt scratchy. The air was thick with smoke from incense, and a small fire was located near the opening at the back of the cave. There he was, the 100-year-old yogi. I didn't know his name. David called out to him. I saw that he had a wrinkled face and a long orangish-white beard. He wore the type of orange one-piece outfit I'd seen other sadhus wearing in cities. He was seated by the fire where he sat stirring the contents of an aluminum pot. I kept crawling. I had butterflies in my stomach and my heart beat hard against my sternum. I felt my age. I felt my knees. I felt the potential ridiculousness of it all. I remembered the weeks and months I'd spent lying on the couch. I remembered my absurd middle-aged soak in the River Jordan. And along with the inner critic, it was as if I could feel every seeking moment of my life entering the cave with me. I could feel every one of these memories, every one of these experiences. I could contact them all at once, and this feeling was big and noisy, and it felt nearly uncontainable. One more paragraph. I was at the tip of the spear of my life, and then the feeling subsided. and a straightforward, typically for me, self-aggressive thought formed. This better be good. This visit with the yogi in the cave had better lived up to its billing. This experience had better be what I'm looking for. It had better feed the insatiable hunger that now lived in me like a tiger. This yogi better be real, I thought. Why? Because if he wasn't real, if he felt it all contrived, I didn't know where to turn next. So just wanted to give you a flavor of I think the craving is the thing I most wanted to feel in that, how much I wanted from this guy, almost in retrospect, almost absurdly so, and how much I needed something from this guy. So again, it's just think of that craving as kind of the fuel that keeps the action moving forward. So I'll pause now. That was I flooded you with a lot of stuff there. I hope some of it made sense. Let me turn to your questions, and I'm sorry we can't do like verbal questions. That would be awesome, but I think there's be too difficult. So here I'm pulling up the questions. How many words did you have written before approaching agents and publishers? So I sold my memoir on proposal. And so what that meant is that I wrote about a 50 to 60 page book proposal, like you would for a nonfiction book, only it was memoir. And it had all the parts of a proposal, including an author bio, an intro, overview. And then the main part of it are the chapter summaries, which are like paragraph or 2 paragraph long summaries of each chapter, and then 2 chapters, sample chapters. And so in all, it was about 60 pages. And so I'd literally only written officially 2 chapters. I dabbled in writing more of it, but I chose to sell it on proposal, which in memoir is sold on both proposal and full manuscript. The beauty of selling on proposal is, you can get somebody interested and you can get their input, and so I can go on about that, but it's a good strategy, especially for those who have a platform already. It can be a good strategy, but it is a good strategy anyway. So, okay. So when approaching publishers, agents, is personal narrative a better pitch? Is the word memoir less marketable? I think you want to call it what it is. And, if you really are writing memoir, I don't think there's anything that makes it less marketable. I don't know that calling anything personal narrative in fact, I think it makes it, I think of a collection of essays, and while that is, you can sell that, I think a memoir is a more saleable thing. So I guess I would defer that to an agent to say, but I think memoir, if you're writing a memoir, you should call it that. And it's my dog buddy, that's Tommy. And he gets tired of my raised voice and has to go lie down elsewhere. So how many words should a memoir be? I think you see everywhere from, on the short end, as short as 60,000. I think my contract called for 60,000, but my book ended up being 320 pages, and they didn't have any problem with that as it got longer. And I think 320 pages must be closer to 100,000. So I think 70 to 80,000 is a good number to aim for. If you've got 90, if you're submitting a full manuscript, if you get over 90, I would start to worry that they may not make it through it all. So, but certainly memoirs are published at 100 and more. How many drafts do you recommend from the rough first final submission piece? That's a good and a tough question. I wrote my book chapter by chapter, and I mean in the order basically. And I also worked with a personal editor that I'd worked with before I sent it off. So I was sent off like 15,000 word chunks to my editor. He barely responded. He just wanted to make sure I was making progress. So, I probably rewrote chapters in all 3 times. the first time was just getting the skeleton and the first layer of muscle down even, and then the second draft is applying that VAST method and making sure it's coherent and has all the different parts I need. And the third draft maybe is less of a complete draft and more of a tidying up, a real aggressive self-editing. But I would be surprised if anybody, can write something worth sending in less than 2 or 3 drafts. Let's see. Can you give some examples of interiority in writing it? Well, yeah, I think that thing I read was a nice example of that. Was all that happened, and that I read about 2 to 3 pages. All that happened was me crawling about 10 feet in those 2 to 3 pages. In the process, I revealed a lot about my internal state of mind. I even made a couple of mentions of my past, and essentially, I did everything I could to know how important this moment of my life was and how badly I needed something to change in my life. And there was also a significant amount of italicized inner critic in my case, because most of my book, part of trauma and PTSD is you get a brutal inner critic, especially childhood complex trauma. And so I really brought that critic out in this kind of italicized inner monologue, inner critic voice. I'm writing about family experiences, some horrific, as refugees in World War II, that I've heard through word of mouth over the years. Since I didn't have the experiences, I don't want to make things up like their feelings, but the written story is turning out to be dry and matter of fact. Is there an approach I can take to make it more engaging? I really respect your desire not to make up feelings. I do think it would be helpful to, even if you admit that you're in conjecture mode, you could say things like, and this may or may not work for you, but I can only imagine, what they were feeling, though I suspect it was, I think you do have to deliver some emotional content to your readers. And I would also maybe just want to look at that piece about whether or not you might want to, play with adding some emotional content from them. This is a tough one. You just remember that this is memoir and not journalism, and there will be a disclaimer at the top that certain scenes are might be compressed. Time, there might be some changes in time, and also names changed. And just know you're creating a piece of writing for somebody else to experience. And so I don't question your decision. I just also know that you're making it difficult for the reader to feel anything. And I don't really have a pat answer. I'm sorry. It's just a consideration. You might try everything you can to add emotional content, especially at least how you feel as you maybe read and heard the stories. Maybe that's the solution. I love what you said about subtraction. What tools do you use to help you know what to subtract from your narrative? This is actually kind of I don't want to fill this with jargon, but there's something called the intentional arc. So all memoir, all personal narrative writing has an external arc, the physical world and physical action, the internal arc, which is the emotional arc, which is the emotions. And the third one's called the intentional arc, and it's really your why. And the thing that helps you understand what you're subtracting from it is anything that's extraneous to like why you're telling the story. I'm telling the story to show just the extent I went to become a adventure writer, and then just the extent I went to heal. And almost anything that went too far outside those lines, I left out. One thing I will say that surprised me, there were many stories of my life that I thought would be full chapters that became like 1 or 2 sentence mentions. And there were things about my life that I thought might be a sentence or a paragraph that became full chapters. And so just be awake to that, and to see the story will tell you what it needs. You listen to the story. This is really a crucial part, is once the story gets going, it really is a matter of it listening to what it wants. Does it need another chapter coming up that is action based, or does it need to slow down, and does it need to go more internal? Does it need to heighten toward the crisis at this moment, or can it wait another chapter or two? So again, I can set the stage and have a little bit more suspense. Also know that, as much as I'm a believer in story, a memoir does have room for digression and for exploring, different angles and ways of looking at your life, and kind of little meandering language sometimes. So try that. Try stretching your legs, but do so with a little bit of, maybe, I don't know, paranoia is too strong a word, but fear that you've got to return to the story fairly soon, because our mind, the reader's mind, is looking for the story. And I may be a little biased, and more biased in this area than a purely creative nonfiction writer, but coming from journalism, but I just know that readers want good stories. And if ever I'm slowing the story down too much, I get worried, and I try to move back to story. You think about structure. Do you write the stories as they come to you in a random order? In the very early going, I do advise, at least I told you I wrote this in pretty much order, but when I coach writers and work with writers, I ask them to write a list of the 10 or 15 scenes or stories that are most essential, that they know belong in the book. And then I have them each day pick one of those stories that they're most interested to have the most heat about writing. And this is in the very early going. I don't think it matters to start at the beginning. I don't even think the very beginning until you start to kind of hack your way into the jungle of this book. And then once you start to find your voice, and to find your storytelling voice, and also your reflection voice, then is the time to really start and get yourself a structure that is plausible, and the one you can lean on, but is also flexible and know it might change a bit. So I guess the short answer to your question is I do encourage you to dabble in different chapters at first, but then try to bring some coherence to the story you're telling, and do go back to the beginning. And then once that story starts to take off, really listen to it, listen to what it's asking of you. Sounds like you use a chronology. What's your opinion of the thematic structure? I think there's lots of ways to structure a book. And I did use a largely chronological order. I did have some flashback chapters, and I had lots of emotional and visual flashbacks that go back in time as I'm traveling. I also think there's amazing memoirs that are written that are based on, like something in the external world, a garden, and how each row is different, and how it inspires you to remember different stories. I don't think it's not the chronology. When I talk about suspense, it's not so much the chronology, of the entire book, but the storytelling of just really leaning into good stories. I also think, there's teaching memoirs that can be really good. I've got a student right now who's writing about like the 12 virtues, and that book is very memoir-esque, but it also has each chapter is not a particular period of his life. It's a different virtue in his thinking about it, with stories from various times of his life. So it can be a great way to structure a book. It really is what feels most appropriate to you. I am kind of a believer in Occam's razor. I would hesitate to get too if it doesn't feel really like in your body, like this is the right approach, if it feels like you're just trying on a new suit of clothes for the heck of it, I would steer away from that just to be different. I would just find where the power and where your body tells you this story needs to be told. What do you look for in a professional critique group? But not sure what to look for in a memoir group. This is a good question. And I know writing groups and generative writing groups are important, and I've been members in them, and they've been great. As someone who's led workshops, I think workshopping is really good for the person who's giving the feedback. I think it really teaches you how to read carefully and offer constructive feedback as a way to learn about good writing. But I do think that on the receiving end of all that feedback from a workshop, especially one with a lot of writers, it can be confusing and you can get a lot of bad advice. I guess, I would think try to find a writing group that is supportive of you making progress, and then try to find a good reader. And even, editors are unfortunately fairly poorly paid. And so often you could send a few chapters off to an editor for, $100 and get some feedback from an editor. So I know I'm only trust the information or the feedback that, again, you feel is right, and watch with the, everybody wants to say, add more here, add more there. And just be distrusting of feedback from people that aren't trained editors, and maybe hear it out. Not a bad thing to hear it out, but be discerning. Have you had backlash from the family? So I have heard through the grapevine that my siblings read the book, and I have heard that my one living parent got about a chapter and a half in and put it down, and that makes me feel sad for him, and that he didn't get to see what I think is a beautiful story about spiritual healing and healing. I understand why. That's all I know, and that just came secondhand. And I also worked hard to, for every finger I pointed at somebody else, I pointed 3 at myself. I have as I identify as a family scapegoat, that kind of sensitive truth teller who felt a lot of the stuff that was happening in the family that was dysfunctional, even though no one else could see it or seemed not to. I held a lot of that shame, and so as a holder of all that shame, I can be quite critical, and I think that's a good strategy. If you're going to point fingers at anybody, point 3 of them back at yourself. Nobody wants to read a purely accusational memoir, and they want to see how you worked through the problem. And so I think a third of the way into the book, I basically really cover this material of, it's time to, back in my maybe late 30s, it's time to stop pointing fingers. I say, and I've got to really admit, this is my life. This is the life I was given, and I've got to figure it out. And I basically have to release everybody from blame, but that doesn't mean that there's not some difficult material early on. What was the A vast again, please? Action. Yeah, action, internal and external. How are we doing, Sean? I might be running. Got a couple more minutes?
Couple more minutes.
Great. I'm 40K into my memoir. I recently uncovered family secrets that changed how I reflect from my heart and my head. Can I weave this in, or is this new information another book? I suspect it's using that voice of experience before you decide it's another book. If the material is about the same action of the book, the same stories, I would try to add that dance of time between the then voice of storytelling and the now voice of reflection. Looking back, you could say, today I've since learned new things about my family that change how I see the events that I just wrote about. And you could then riff on that for a few paragraphs. So I think I would make an attempt to do that. And by the way, it's a good book to read. The two books I recommend usually to my clients, and I need to come up with some more titles because both of these are by men, but one of them is Storycraft by Jack Hart, H-A-R-T. And that has just a lot of wonderful craft fundamentals, not necessarily about memoir writing per se, but about narrative nonfiction, but they're all applicable to memoir writing, how to tell a good anecdote, how to write a good scene, those kinds of things. The other book is To Show and to Tell by Philip Lopate. And it's especially good for essayists, but it's all applicable to memoir too. And he has a great chapter in there called, basically it addresses this retrospection and the reasons why this telling, this reflection is important. And one of the things it does do, if you didn't notice, it does spoil suspense a bit. I mean, because you're actually adding input from your current day state of mind. So the reader, and obviously, but it's in such an obvious way, the reader knows you survived, or else you wouldn't be writing this book. So it doesn't cripple the suspense. It's not like telling the reader the outcome of an event as you're telling it. So I don't worry about, but Philip Lopate talks a lot about these things in that book.
We've got just a couple more minutes.
Okay.
I think we'll have time for the other remaining questions.
You say we do, or?
I think so. I think we can finish the questions in the chat.
Besides your memoir, what are must-read memoirs for aspiring writers? I think of them in terms of structure. I think, and some of this is stuff that that I've taught so much, I kind of lean on. I do spend a lot of time teaching Wild by Cheryl Strayed. I think it's a great example of a book that has a contemporary forward-moving narrative of her hiking a trail with deeper flashbacks, and you get the meat of her life journey through those flashbacks. And so, of course, the main narrative is moving forward as she hikes the trail. For lack of originality, one book that I teach for present tense memoir writing is Love Warrior. I don't think it's an outstanding piece of writing, but I think it's a real urgent, powerful piece of present tense memoir writing. For more of a complex, but one that really does a good job of developing the reflective voice and the narrative voice and combining them and playing with them. I think Educated is a great example of that. But these are all examples that are a few years old, but those are ones that come up to my mind. After you completed your memoir and submitted it, were you asked to make additional edits, asked to remove or rearrange sections? Yeah, not much. There was not much that was moved around. It was basically edited, and then we had a legal process that was quite involved, and there were a lot of small changes made during the legal vetting process. But basically the book went in as it was sort of surprising how again, but it was a chronological book. So it might be different if you're working on a different type of book. I do provide private consulting work. So reach out to me. My website is bradwetzler.com, and my last name is Wetzler. And I'm also starting, and you can't purchase it yet, but next week you will be. I'm starting a new weekly memoir support group that's going to be very probably priced at about $90 a month or something like that for 4 meetings a month, and an hour and 15 minutes or so for kind of talking through stuff, talking through the issues you're working on. So I encourage you to check that out next week. It's not quite up on my website.
I think those are all the questions we've got.
Okay, good. Well, I'm so happy to have been here, and I'm sorry that I didn't really get to meet you all, but I appreciate you listening, and thank you. So good luck with writing, and I hope you wish you the best. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I haven't written a single word of nonfiction in my life because I like lying better, but I feel like I could write nonfiction after this. This was really, really informative. Thank you everyone for being here. Brad's memoir is titled Into the Soul of the World. I'm going to be sending you all a PDF excerpt of it so you can get another taste of how it is. And if you found the advice in this illuminating, Brad has a workshop coming up with us called Show and Tell. It's on May 25th, and it runs from 7 to 10 p.m. US Eastern Time. Brad, do you have anything else to say?
No, you'll learn some of these things we talked about tonight, but we'll be doing it with practice writing and unpacking it and having read out loud. We'll go a lot deeper into it and some other concepts too. So I would love to see you in that class, and I would love your support to buy the book if that works for you. It's a tough market out there selling books with all the kinds of entertainment we have now. So if you feel inspired at all, I would love it if you'd buy my book. So thank you for letting me pitch it.
Brad, thank you so much again. This was delightful. Thank you everyone for being here. You all have a wonderful night.
Good night.